My mother did not miss my doctoral graduation because of a sudden illness or bad traffic. She missed it for my brother's backyard barbecue, preferring investor photos and loud laughs over my academic cap. But the exact week my family decided I was disposable, they unknowingly placed me in the most dangerous position possible for them. The truth did not return with screaming. It arrived with files, signatures, data, and a daughter who finally stopped being their cushion. My name is Harper Green. I am 33 years old. I sat completely alone in the driver's seat of my parked sedan, just outside the grand auditorium of Blue Ridge Commonwealth University. The engine was off, and the air inside the cabin was growing thick and warm under the late morning sun, but I did not roll down the windows. I was wearing the full academic regalia required for the commencement ceremony. The heavy black fabric of my gown pooled awkwardly around my legs, and the velvet tam rested heavily on my lap. The hood, draped around my neck, carried the specific colors designating my doctorate in environmental toxicology and public water systems. My research involved tracing toxic industrial runoff in rural water grids, a complex systemic analysis designed to prevent slow-moving public health disasters. It was an armor of academia that had taken me nearly 10 years of relentless research, grant writing, sleepless nights, and grueling lab work to earn. Yet, sitting in the suffocating silence of my car, I had never felt more invisible. My phone vibrated against the center console. The screen lit up, displaying a missed call and a new voicemail from my mother. For a brief, foolish second, my heart lifted. I thought perhaps they were lost trying to find the parking structure, or maybe they were stuck at the entrance gates of the university. I unlocked the screen and pressed play. Holding the speaker to my ear, my mother spoke, and her voice was buoyant, light, and entirely devoid of guilt. She told me that the whole family was currently gathered in the backyard of my younger brother, Mason Green. They were hosting a barbecue, she explained, because some very important investors had dropped by unexpectedly to look into his business venture. Her tone was brisk, the kind of casual tone one uses when explaining a minor change in dinner plans or a trip to the grocery store. She ended the short message by cheerfully adding that they would just watch the video of my graduation ceremony tonight. I lowered the phone slowly and stared at the dashboard. Watch the video tonight. She said it as if my graduation ceremony, the culmination of my entire academic career, was nothing more than a recorded baseball game they could stream later while eating leftover potato salad. There was no apology in her voice. There was no hesitation. There was only the absolute certainty that her choice was the correct one, and that I would simply understand and step aside, just as I always did. A moment later, a flurry of notifications pinged from the family group chat. I opened the application and stared at the bright screen. My aunt was uploading pictures in rapid succession. There was a high-resolution photo of large metal trays filled with perfectly glazed smoked brisket and ribs. There was a wide shot of the long outdoor tables decorated with expensive rustic centerpieces. And there was a video clip of Mason standing at the head of the patio, laughing loudly and raising a glass of craft beer to toast his wealthy guests. Mason had dropped out of community college after 2 semesters. He had always been the charismatic one, the former county football star who could talk his way out of any consequence. Today, he was wearing a branded apron over a casual shirt, effortlessly charming people with money to fund his latest venture. My mother was visible in the background of the video, smiling proudly, carrying a tray of drinks, making sure everyone was comfortable and entertained. I scrolled up through the chat history. I looked at the timestamps spanning from the early morning until this very minute. I searched for a single message directed at me. There was nothing. Not one person had sent a text saying good luck today. Not one person had typed the word congratulations before I walked into the hall to receive the highest academic degree possible. I was a ghost in my own family, completely overshadowed by a platter of smoked meat and the promise of investor capital. I locked my phone and dropped it into my purse. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing down my hair and securing my velvet cap on my head. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the staging area. The campus was alive with joyous noise. Everywhere I looked, I saw large families clustered together. I saw fathers adjusting their daughters' hoods, mothers fixing ties, siblings holding massive bouquets of flowers and brightly colored balloons. The air hummed with the specific, vibrant energy of shared pride. I walked through them like a shadow, finding my assigned spot in the alphabetical line of doctoral candidates waiting in the wide corridor. The staging room was chaotic and loud, but my immediate vicinity felt like a vacuum. I stood staring blankly at the back of the gown in front of me. I realized my own hood was twisted, the colors hidden by an awkward fold of velvet, but I had no one to ask to fix it. A woman standing next to me in line gently touched my arm. She was an older woman, perhaps in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back elegantly and lines of deep, earned exhaustion around her eyes. She was also a late graduating doctoral student, waiting for her own moment to walk the stage. I watched her eyes quickly scan my perimeter, noting the absolute absence of a cheering section, the lack of a partner holding a camera, the missing parents waiting to hug me. She looked at my twisted hood and reached out with gentle, steady hands to smooth the fabric over my shoulders, arranging the colors so they laid perfectly flat across my back. She looked me right in the eyes. She did not offer empty pity or ask invasive questions about where my people were. She simply said a very short, quiet sentence: "If your family is not coming, I will clap for their part." I swallowed hard, the tightness in my throat suddenly sharp and overwhelming. That brief sentence, spoken by a total stranger in a crowded hallway, became the solitary moment of profound kindness I received that entire day. I nodded to her, unable to form words without my voice breaking. The procession began. The traditional brass music echoed through the massive auditorium as we marched down the center aisle. The seats were packed with thousands of people, a sea of faces straining to see their loved ones. I took my seat and endured the long, droning speeches of the university officials. My mind was entirely blank. I did not think about my dissertation on water systems. I did not think about the thousands of hours spent in the laboratory. I only thought about the heavy, undeniable truth settling into my bones. Finally, they began calling the names. We lined up beside the grand stage. The older woman was a few people ahead of me. When her name was called, I clapped as hard as I could, watching her smile brightly toward a small cluster of people in the balcony. Then, it was my turn. Dr. Harper Green. The name boomed through the speakers. I walked across the wide expanse of the stage. The bright spotlight hit my face, blinding me for a fraction of a second. As I reached out to shake the hands of the dean and accept the leather-bound diploma cover, I listened to the auditorium. There was polite, scattered applause from the general audience. But cutting through it all, clear and sharp, was the sound of one person clapping exceptionally loud. It was the older woman from the line, keeping her promise. She was cheering for my missing family. It was in the exact center of that stage, under the glare of the lights, with a stranger giving me the only standing ovation I would receive, that I finally understood a deeply painful truth. For years, I had believed that if I just worked harder, if I just achieved more, if I became completely self-sufficient and caused zero problems, my family would eventually celebrate me. I thought my independence was a virtue they respected, but the loud applause of a stranger illuminated the reality of my existence. In my family, I was always the postponable achievement. I was the reliable, sturdy background noise. I was the one whose milestones could be skipped for a backyard barbecue because they knew I would never throw a tantrum, demand attention, or stop loving them. They had factored my silent forgiveness into their daily lives as a permanent, unbreakable constant. I walked down the opposite stairs and returned to my seat. The ceremony concluded an hour later. The graduates poured out onto the sweeping green lawns of the campus. It was a beautiful, sunny afternoon. Everywhere around me, corks popped from champagne bottles. Parents cried and pulled their children into tight, proud embraces. Cameras flashed continuously. I stood alone near the edge of the lawn, holding my diploma cover. I did not shed a single tear. The deep, aching sorrow that had threatened to suffocate me in the car had completely evaporated, In its place, something entirely new took root. I felt a sudden, chilling calmness wash over every nerve in my body. It was a cold, absolute clarity. I watched a father lift his daughter off the ground in celebration nearby, and I felt nothing but a quiet, clinical detachment from the family that shared my blood. I knew, with frightening certainty, that the Harper who had waited for her parents' approval was dead. The woman standing on the grass was someone else entirely. The calmness settling over me was not forgiveness, and it was not resignation. It was the silent, internal click of a heavy door locking shut forever. It was the precise moment I decided to stop being the soft cushion my family used to break their falls. My mother, my father, and my brother thought they were simply skipping a boring academic ceremony to entertain investors. They had no idea that they had just severed the only tether holding back the consequences of their own actions. I turned my back on the celebration, walked straight to my car, and drove away without looking back. Growing up in our middle-class home in North Carolina felt like participating in a bizarre psychology experiment, where I was the neglected control group and my brother was the highly observed, intensely nurtured variable. The walls of our suburban house, with its faded yellow paint and squeaky wooden stairs, seemed to literally tilt toward his bedroom, drawn by an invisible, undeniable gravity. He possessed the kind of golden boy aura that made strict teachers extend assignment deadlines and angry neighbors completely overlook broken greenhouse windows. People naturally gravitated toward him. He had an easy, magnetic smile and a loud, infectious laugh that effortlessly filled up all the empty spaces in any given room. My parents basked in that golden glow. They absorbed his popularity as if it were their own personal achievement, treating his social ease as a currency that elevated the entire household. I, on the other hand, was assigned a completely different utilitarian role from the moment I was old enough to tie my own shoelaces. I was the sturdy, invisible architecture. I was the child who finished complex science projects without ever asking for poster board money. The one who never missed a curfew by even a single minute. The one who navigated the turbulent waters of teenage angst with a terrifying, absolute silence. The vocabulary my parents used to describe me was entirely devoid of passion or pride. Harper is sensible. Harper is incredibly stable. Harper simply understands the situation. It sounds like a solid compliment until you slowly realize that being the child who does not need to be worried about translates directly into being the child who does not need to be seen at all. The stark contrast in how our lives were funded, managed, and celebrated became blindingly obvious during our early 20s. When he decided that traditional paths were too confining and demanded to open a mobile barbecue operation, my parents did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. They liquidated a massive portion of their retirement savings and quietly took out a second mortgage on the yellow house to buy him a customized, stainless steel food truck. I remember sitting perfectly still at the kitchen table, watching my father sign the heavy stack of bank drafts. My mother defended the reckless financial plunge with a trembling, defensive voice, insisting to the empty room that he just needed a single solid chance to prove his entrepreneurial genius. He needed substantial capital to match his grand vision. The food truck lasted exactly 18 months before the engine completely died on a highway, and the county health inspector permanently shut it down due to gross negligence regarding meat storage temperatures. My parents did not yell. They did not ground him or demand repayment. They simply paid the heavy municipal fines, absorbed his crippling debt, and patted his shoulder, telling him the market just was not ready for his ideas. Exactly 4 months after that spectacular financial failure, I sat at that exact same kitchen table and handed my mother a thick envelope containing an official letter from my university. It stated, in bold lettering, that I had been awarded a full academic scholarship to cover my entire master's degree and subsequent doctoral track, complete with a generous living stipend. I had beaten out hundreds of top-tier applicants across the country. I had completely secured my own future without costing my family a single dime. My mother read the letter, placed it flat on the wooden surface, and gave me a mild, distracted smile. She told me to make sure I did not overwork my nervous system because stress is bad for digestion. Before I could even process the lukewarm clinical response, she tapped the table and reminded me that she desperately needed me to come home on the last weekend of the month to organize the complex family tax documents because she could never figure out the new software system. There was no celebratory dinner at a nice restaurant. There was no proud announcement to the extended family network. My profound academic victory was treated as a minor administrative update, immediately followed by a demand for free labor. That was the established, immovable ecosystem of our household. Whenever he stumbled, no matter how predictable or self-inflicted the crisis was, my parents instantly transformed into a highly efficient, deeply empathetic emergency response unit. They threw money, time, and endless emotional labor into cushioning his falls. Whenever I succeeded, they treated it as a baseline expectation. My achievements were merely the standard operating procedure, a boring, reliable machine that required absolutely no applause to keep running. Because of this deeply ingrained dynamic, I learned how to orchestrate my own existence completely in the dark. I became an expert at solitary milestones. I spent countless hours researching and applying for complex federal grants in total isolation, lit only by the glow of a library computer. I packed my own apartments and drove heavy, rented moving vans across state lines entirely by myself, hauling heavy boxes of textbooks up 3 flights of stairs while listening to the local radio. I prepped for grueling, high-stakes academic interviews by speaking to my own reflection in a cramped bathroom mirror. Whenever I published a peer-reviewed paper in a major journal or cleared a terrifying hurdle in my defense process, I did not call home to share the news. Instead, I would walk to a cheap, all-night diner near the campus, order a black coffee and a slice of cherry pie, and sit in a sticky vinyl booth alone, raising my thick ceramic mug to my own reflection in the dark window. I had convinced myself over the years that this fierce, impenetrable independence was a brilliant shield. I genuinely thought I was protecting myself from their apathy by preemptively never asking for their participation in my life. But standing in the quiet, empty aftermath of the commencement ceremony, all my intellectual rationalizations completely crumbled into dust. The profound, suffocating ache in my chest was not simply about a missed photograph or a forgotten congratulatory text message. The sharp, breathtaking pain came from the undeniable realization that the empty chairs in that auditorium were not a scheduling anomaly. They were the ultimate, undeniable physical manifestation of a family system that had been operating with ruthless, terrifying efficiency for decades. The barbecue was not a mistake. It was a loud, clear declaration of my absolute lack of value. The evening sun was fully sinking below the city skyline by the time I finally unlocked the heavy wooden door to my apartment. The living space was completely silent, heavy with the stale, warm air of a room that had been empty all day. The only spots of color in the dim room were 2 large, vibrant floral arrangements sitting on the kitchen island, sent by my laboratory colleagues. I dropped my heavy keys into the ceramic bowl by the door and hung my long black academic gown carefully on a metal hook. I did not turn on the television to drown out the oppressive quiet. I did not pour a glass of wine to numb the sharp edges of the day. I walked straight to my small wooden desk, woke up my laptop computer, and opened my electronic mail inbox. There, sitting at the very top of the list, was a message I had been actively avoiding for 3 entire days. It was a formal job offer from the Caldwell Center for Civic Risk, an elite, heavily funded private research institute based in Milwaukee. The position was exactly what I had trained for, focusing heavily on analyzing structural vulnerabilities and environmental toxic threats in public infrastructure. The compensation package was excellent, the research budget was incredibly robust, and most importantly, it required relocating hundreds of miles away from the borders of North Carolina. For the past 72 hours, I had stared at that specific email, paralyzed by the familiar, pathetic hope that always kept me securely tethered to my family. I had told myself to wait until after graduation to make a decision. I had whispered to myself that maybe seeing me in my academic robes, holding the highest degree possible, would finally flip a switch in their minds. I had bargained with my own dignity, thinking that maybe next year they would finally have enough emotional bandwidth to include me in their orbit. I had actively considered declining the prestigious offer and taking a lower-paying, far less challenging position at a local firm just to stay within a 2-hour driving distance, just in case they ever actually needed me for something other than tax preparation or cleaning up legal messes. Now, sitting alone in the blue glow of the computer screen, that pathetic, childish hope was entirely dead. The illusion had been completely burned away by the heat of a backyard grill, leaving nothing but hard, quantifiable facts. My family would never magically be better next year. They would never wake up one morning and suddenly realize my worth. I was merely a phantom supporting a house that only ever threw parties for someone else. I opened the email. I read through the complex employment terms one final time. I did not pause to consider how my mother would handle her complicated paperwork without me. I did not wonder who would bail my brother out of his next inevitable, expensive disaster. I moved my fingers firmly across the keyboard, typing out a clear, concise, and highly professional acceptance of the position. I hit send. The screen refreshed, confirming the message was gone forever. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator in the silent apartment, and for the first time in my entire 33 years of life, I felt the terrifying, magnificent weight of absolute freedom. The transition to the Caldwell Center for Civic Risk was not a sudden act of rebellion. It was a highly calculated extraction. My new title was Senior Researcher, and my portfolio was heavily focused on modeling water source vulnerabilities and tracking industrial discharge within complex food supply chains. It was rigorous, unforgiving work that demanded absolute precision, which was exactly the kind of environment my mind craved. I gave myself exactly 6 weeks to completely dismantle my life in North Carolina. I did not storm into my parents' house to deliver a dramatic farewell speech. I did not initiate any tearful arguments, nor did I linger by my telephone waiting for an apology that I knew with absolute certainty would never materialize. I operated with the cold, mechanical efficiency of someone defusing a bomb. I sold my bulky furniture, packed my academic books into uniform cardboard boxes, and systematically erased my physical footprint from the state. On the morning I handed over my apartment keys to the landlord, I sat in the driver's seat of my loaded vehicle and drafted a single electronic mail to my mother and father. It was incredibly brief. I informed them of my new job title and my relocation to Milwaukee. I stated, without any softening adjectives, that I would need significant space moving forward. Most importantly, I explicitly wrote that I was no longer available to be contacted only when the family required someone to clean up their collateral damage. I did not use an angry tone. I wrote it as a matter of plain, administrative fact. I hit send, merged onto the interstate highway, and drove north. The replies arrived in my inbox exactly as I predicted, validating every single reason I had for leaving. My mother responded first. Her message opened with a shallow, obligatory inquiry about whether Milwaukee was very cold this time of year. She did not ask about the Caldwell Center, or what a senior researcher actually did. Instead, in the very next sentence, she seamlessly pivoted the entire conversation back to her favorite subject. She wrote paragraphs about how Mason was currently securing property for a much larger barbecue business model. She typed out the phrase that he finally had a chance to change his life, completely ignoring the fact that he had been given dozens of expensive chances before. It was the classic, half-hearted concern she always offered me, quickly tossed aside to make room for my brother and his endless ambitions. My father did not write paragraphs. He replied to my boundary-setting email with exactly one sentence. He wrote that I was letting my emotions make me think wrong about our family. There was no reflection, no accountability, and certainly no attempt to understand my perspective. In his mind, my departure was just an irrational, feminine overreaction to a perceived slight, rather than a logical response to a lifetime of systematic neglect. Then came the text message from Mason. He sent it directly to my cellular phone. He did not say a single word about my newly acquired doctoral degree. He did not ask if I had arrived safely in my new city. He simply attached a digital image file. It was a newly designed, highly stylized graphic logo for his upcoming chain, which he had decided to name Fireline Pit House. Beneath the image, he typed a quick question, asking me if the design looked premium enough to pull major investors. I sat on the worn couch of my new, partially unpacked living room and stared at his message. For my entire adult life, my automatic response to a request from my family was instant compliance. I was programmed to offer my critical analysis, my free editing skills, or my practical advice the moment they snapped their fingers. The urge to reply, to dissect the font choices and the marketability of the logo, flared up purely out of deep-rooted habit. I typed out a half sentence. Then, I stopped. I erased the letters. I locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the wooden coffee table. For the very first time in my existence, I let a demand from my family sit there unanswered. I did not fix it. I did not facilitate his dream. I simply let the silence stretch out, and in that silence, I reclaimed a massive piece of my own autonomy. Milwaukee offered a stark, refreshing contrast to the humid, suffocating familiarity of the South. I rented a small, practical duplex in a quiet neighborhood, lined with old brick buildings and tall, sturdy trees. My new living space was sparse, holding only the bare essentials, but the emptiness felt incredibly luxurious. I spent my initial evenings unpacking books, walking around the unfamiliar blocks, and breathing in the crisp air coming off the lake. I quickly realized that geographical distance was not a magical cure. Moving hundreds of miles away did not instantly heal the deep, aching resentment I carried inside my chest. However, the physical separation did something far more important. It completely removed the daily, deafening noise of my family. Without their constant crises and dismissive comments distorting my reality, I could finally hear my own thoughts clearly. The truth of my situation was no longer buried under heavy layers of manufactured guilt and forced obligation. My integration into the Caldwell Center was rapid and intensely satisfying. Within my first few weeks, the directors recognized that my brain worked differently. I was not just cataloging environmental data. I was hunting for the invisible threads that tied seemingly unrelated pieces of information together. I was assigned to a massive, complex project analyzing rural infrastructure and private sector negligence. I spent my days sifting through thousands of pages of municipal zoning laws, historical water quality reports, and corporate waste disposal logs. My colleagues were brilliant, driven individuals who spoke my language. They did not care if I was quiet, or if I preferred eating my lunch alone while reading complex spreadsheets. They valued me exclusively for my capacity to synthesize vast amounts of dry data into coherent, actionable intelligence. I quickly developed a reputation within the Institute for building early warning models. I had a unique talent for taking fragmented, isolated statistics and connecting them to reveal a larger, far more dangerous picture. I could look at a slight anomaly in soil temperatures, cross-reference it with a minor shift in local transport routes, and predict a major industrial leak months before it actually happened. I was celebrated for my ability to see the problems before anyone else even knew where to look. It was a profound, deeply ironic shift in my reality. The exact same hypervigilance and quiet observation skills that I had developed as a survival mechanism in my chaotic, dismissive childhood home were now the very tools making me a highly respected expert in my professional field. I was finally being rewarded for seeing the truth instead of being punished for it. I threw myself entirely into the work. I arrived at the research facility early every morning and stayed long after the sun went down. I mapped out intricate webs of corporate accountability, tracing how small acts of negligence at the ground level could poison entire communities downstream. I was completely focused, meticulously building a fortress of data and logic around myself. I thought I had successfully left the mess of my bloodline far behind me in North Carolina. I genuinely believed that by ignoring their messages and focusing on my systemic risk models, I had finally cut the cord. I had no idea that my professional focus and my personal history were rapidly accelerating toward a devastating collision. The Caldwell Center had hired me to find hidden disasters, and I was about to find one that carried my own family name. My mandate at the Institute escalated rapidly during my third month. I was assigned to spearhead a joint initiative funded by a federal environmental agency and our private think tank. The objective was highly specific and deeply critical. We were tasked with identifying industrial-scale food processing clusters that were quietly discharging toxic organic waste into rural, unregulated public water systems before state inspectors could catch them. It was a massive digital manhunt. I was handed access to a sprawling database containing millions of localized records spanning the last 48 months. It included agricultural zoning permits, satellite soil saturation imagery, and municipal water quality logs. My job was to build a predictive algorithm that could hunt through this mountain of bureaucratic noise and find the silent, hidden polluters. I spent weeks entirely submerged in the raw data, looking for negative space. Fraud, especially environmental fraud, rarely looks like a glaring red flag. It usually manifests as a series of perfectly timed, highly convenient coincidences. Late one Tuesday afternoon, my model flagged a strange, persistent anomaly spreading across 3 neighboring counties. It was a network of mid-sized commercial smokehouses and regional meat preparation facilities. On paper, they looked entirely compliant, but when I layered their operational data, a very clear pattern of evasion emerged. They were systematically dodging random health inspections by utilizing obscure loopholes in county scheduling. More alarmingly, their required daily temperature logs for meat storage and rendering vats showed signs of being manually altered, with identical, mathematically improbable baseline numbers recorded for consecutive weeks at a time. But the most glaring irregularity was their waste disposal chain. Facilities handling massive volumes of raw meat and rendered animal fat are legally required to employ certified hazardous waste transport units to remove the heavy grease, chemical solvents, and organic runoff. I pulled the invoice records for this specific network and cross-referenced the vendor names with the State Department of Transportation fleet registries. The transport companies they were paying thousands of dollars to simply did not exist. They were ghost entities, paper corporations with 0 registered pumping trucks and no authorized drivers. The toxic sludge was not being hauled away to a proper treatment plant. It was vanishing entirely off the grid. I began triangulating the geographic data, mapping the fraudulent invoices, the altered logs, and the newest building permits to find the epicenter of the network. My algorithm highlighted a single, high-risk hub located precisely in Hollow Creek County. It was a massive, newly acquired parcel of land zoned for heavy commercial food preparation. The data indicated that this central hub was designed to act as the primary rendering and processing engine for the entire Tri-County network. I pulled up the state business registry on my secondary monitor to identify the corporate entity holding the deed to the Hollow Creek property. The screen refreshed, displaying the public legal filings. My hand instantly froze on the computer mouse. My breath caught sharply in the back of my throat, a cold spike of adrenaline shooting directly into my sternum. The legal name registered on the land deed was Green Ember Hospitality Limited Liability Company. It was the exact shell corporation my father had established over a decade ago to shield his personal assets during his early business ventures. I stared at the bright white screen, my eyes tracing the letters over and over again. The massive, high-risk facility preparing for a grand opening was not a random corporate polluter. It was my brother's brand-new flagship location. It was the very same project my mother had bragged about in her electronic mail. The one heralded as the massive turning point that would finally elevate Fireline Pit House from a local joke into a lucrative, dominant regional brand. The property they were leveraging their entire future on was sitting dead center in the middle of a systemic environmental fraud ring. I pushed my chair back from the desk, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I brought up a detailed geographic information system map of the Hollow Creek parcel, zooming in tightly on the immediate surrounding topography. What I saw made the blood drain entirely from my face. The flagship facility was situated on a slight elevation, directly above a highly permeable limestone aquifer. Bordering the southern edge of the property was a dense cluster of low-income residential housing. Because it was an unincorporated rural zone, those homes were not connected to a municipal water purification grid. They relied entirely on shallow, private groundwater wells. Less than half a mile downstream from the property line sat an old community church. The satellite imagery clearly showed a large, active community garden behind the parish hall. A plot I knew from standard demographic overlays was likely used to grow fresh vegetables for the elderly population in the area. If the unlined grease traps and chemical runoff from a massive, unregulated barbecue production facility seeped into that porous ground, it would not just cause a minor zoning violation. It would dump astronomical levels of nitrates, dangerous pathogens, and rotting organic compounds directly into the drinking water of people who could not afford bottled water or expensive filtration systems. It would poison the soil feeding the neighborhood seniors. This terrifying realization shattered the final remnants of my childhood perspective. This was no longer a bitter domestic dispute about parents playing favorites or a golden child getting too many financial bailouts. This was the exact intersection where unchecked family entitlement, desperate financial gambling, and blind arrogance collided with severe real-world danger. My family was about to build their long-awaited empire on top of a toxic time bomb, and innocent people were going to drink the fallout. I did not hesitate. I did not call my mother to warn her, and I certainly did not message my brother to ask for an explanation. I printed the deed registry, the ghost transport invoices, and the topographical well maps. I placed them in a stark manila folder, walked straight down the long carpeted corridor, and knocked firmly on the heavy glass door of the project director. I sat across from him and laid the documents on his polished mahogany desk. I spoke with absolute clinical detachment. I formally declared a direct, severe conflict of interest. I explained that the primary high-risk target identified by my algorithm was owned by an entity controlled by my immediate family members. I fully expected him to pull my security clearance for the project, assign me to a different division, and perhaps question my professional integrity for not catching it sooner. Instead, the director looked over the paperwork, closed the folder, and looked at me with deep, professional respect. He thanked me for my immediate, unhesitating transparency. He stated that because I was the only person who fully understood the complex architecture of the tracking algorithm, removing me would cripple the investigation. We reached an immediate, strict compromise. I was granted permission to remain entirely in charge of the raw data analysis and the geographic modeling. However, I would be completely walled off from the final policy formulation, and I would have absolutely zero input or access regarding the subsequent legal enforcement recommendations forwarded to the federal authorities. I agreed to the terms without a single flinch. I walked back to my desk, my professional reputation entirely intact, my ethical boundaries clearly defined. That night, back in the quiet isolation of my rented duplex, I lay wide awake in the dark. The city traffic hummed softly through the glass of my bedroom window. I stared up at the blank ceiling for hours. I was not crying. I felt absolutely no heartbreak over the impending collapse of my brother's grand culinary dream. Instead, I felt a heavy, cold dread settling deep into my stomach. I had spent my entire life watching my family light small fires and walk away, leaving me to quietly stamp out the embers before they burned the house down. But this time, they had poured gasoline over an entire community. I saw the tripwire pulled tight, anchored directly to their arrogant, reckless hands, and for the very first time, I knew I was not going to dive in front of the blast to save them. The phone rang 3 times before my father answered. The connection was perfectly clear. I did not raise my voice, nor did I allow any frantic, daughterly concern to bleed into my tone. I spoke with the practiced, level cadence of a professional delivering a critical site evaluation. I informed him that the proprietary predictive models at my institute had flagged the new Hollow Creek facility. I detailed the severe risks associated with their current organic waste storage protocols and the highly suspicious anomalies in their discharge routing. I laid out the facts as plainly as I could, hoping the sheer gravity of federal environmental terminology would pierce through his usual thick layer of familial complacency. There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. For a brief, naive second, I genuinely thought he was processing the magnitude of the liability. I waited for him to ask about containment solutions. I waited for him to request the specific metric data or ask for a contractor recommendation to fix the unlined pits before the groundwater was permanently contaminated. Instead, he let out a long, heavy sigh that sounded more like an expression of deep boredom than actual concern. Then, he spoke the exact words that permanently severed whatever fragile thread still connected me to my childhood. He asked if I was really still this angry about them missing my graduation ceremony. The sheer absurdity of the question felt like a physical blow to the chest. He was standing on the precipice of an environmental disaster that could ruin dozens of lives and result in massive federal fines, and his immediate reflex was to reduce my scientific warning to the petty grudge of a jealous daughter. Before I could even formulate a response to that breathtaking level of gaslighting, the sound of the phone shuffling passed through the speaker. My brother seized the device. I did not even hear a greeting. Mason just let out that familiar, patronizing chuckle he always used when he thought someone was taking life entirely too seriously. He told me that I always loved hearing myself sound significantly smarter than everyone else in the room. He brushed off my warnings about the structural integrity of the holding tanks and the phantom disposal vendors as if I were complaining about the color of the paint on the walls. He confidently declared that municipal health inspections and environmental audits were nothing more than standard bureaucratic paperwork, and that anyone with an ounce of real-world business sense knew exactly how to handle them. He told me to stick to my little laboratory models and let the men handle the actual commerce. Then, he ended the call. I set the phone down on my desk. The silence in my duplex was absolute. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone against the wall. The anger I felt was far too dense and heavy for that kind of theatrical release. I opened my laptop and began to type. I drafted a comprehensive, formal electronic mail addressed to both my father and my brother. I removed any trace of sisterly emotion. I wrote it as a senior risk analyst addressing a non-compliant entity. I laid out 4 non-negotiable recommendations. First, I advised them to immediately halt the scheduled grand opening of the facility. Second, I strongly urged them to hire a certified, independent environmental auditor to inspect the premises. Third, I demanded they order comprehensive, third-party laboratory sampling of the private well water servicing the residential neighborhood bordering their property line. Fourth, I instructed them to conduct a brutal, granular review of every single waste disposal contract they had signed. I hit send and watched the message disappear into the digital void. Less than an hour later, my mobile device buzzed with a direct text message from my mother. I opened it, foolishly hoping that at least one person in that household possessed a functional moral compass. Her message did not contain a single word of concern for the low-income families living down the hill from their toxic runoff. She did not ask if the drinking water was actually in danger. Instead, she demanded to know if I realized that delaying the grand opening by even a few weeks would cause Mason to lose his primary financial investor. She accused me of trying to sabotage his one legitimate chance at success just because I felt left out of the family dynamic. I deleted the message. I went to sleep knowing I had done my absolute ethical duty to warn them. 2 days passed in relative quiet. On Thursday morning, while drinking my coffee before heading into the institute, I opened my web browser to check the local news aggregates for Hollow Creek County. Purely out of a dark, lingering curiosity, I navigated to the newly launched promotional website for Fireline Pit House. The homepage was a slick, expensive masterpiece of modern marketing. There were high-definition videos of slow-roasted meats, rustic wood fires, and smiling, attractive people holding craft beers. I scrolled down the page, past the menu options and the grand opening countdown timer. Near the bottom, tucked into a section designed to build corporate trust and highlight their commitment to the community, my eyes locked onto a single, prominently displayed sentence. It proudly proclaimed that the facility operations and environmental safety protocols had been reviewed and verified by leading environmental systems researcher Dr. Harper Green. The ceramic coffee mug slipped from my fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor. Hot liquid splashed across my bare ankles, but I did not feel the burn. I simply sat there, completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated audacity radiating from the screen. Mason had not ignored my warning email. He had weaponized it. He had taken the formal scientific language I used to explicitly warn them of a catastrophic failure, chopped the sentences into disconnected fragments, and brazenly reassembled them to manufacture a glowing professional endorsement. He had stolen my academic title, my hard-earned professional credibility, and the very name I had spent 10 years building, all to act as a bulletproof shield for his illegal operation. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. This was the exact moment the fundamental nature of my reality shifted permanently. For 33 years, I had believed that my family merely took me for granted. I thought their worst crime was simply a lack of attention and a surplus of apathy. But staring at that fraudulent website, the brutal truth finally crystallized in my mind. They were not just ignoring me. They were actively exploiting me. They were entirely willing to sacrifice my career, my reputation, and potentially my legal standing to protect a business venture they knew was structurally compromised. They had assumed that my lifelong habit of silent compliance meant I would never have the spine to publicly contradict them. The shock quickly burned away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline fury. I did not shed a single tear. I did not call my mother to beg her to intervene. I bent down, carefully picked up the broken shards of the ceramic mug, and threw them into the trash. I returned to my computer. I opened a screen capture application and meticulously recorded every single pixel of the fraudulent website. I saved the images, ensuring the date and timestamps were clearly visible on the files. Then, I opened a new document and began drafting a devastatingly precise cease and desist notice. I cited specific intellectual property laws and federal regulations regarding the unauthorized use of academic credentials in commercial marketing. I demanded the immediate and permanent removal of my name and professional title from all their promotional materials, both digital and physical. I did not send this notice as a concerned sister. I sent it via certified digital delivery, ensuring I received a legally binding read receipt. After the notice was dispatched, I created a secure, encrypted folder on my hard drive. I named it with the date. Inside, I deposited the screenshots of the website, the original warning email I had sent them, the dismissive text message from my mother, and the exact duration logs of the phone call with my father and brother. I began meticulously building an ironclad timeline. I documented every single point of contact, every warning issued, and every dismissal received. They thought they were dealing with the quiet, compliant girl who always folded under pressure. They had completely forgotten that they were dealing with a woman whose entire professional existence revolved around gathering evidence, identifying the guilty party, and delivering the absolute, undeniable truth. I was no longer trying to save them. I was building the exact case that would bury them. To ensure my defense was absolutely impenetrable, I spent my entire weekend systematically archiving every digital interaction I had ever recorded with my parents and my brother. I dug through the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a heavy stack of old external hard drives. Years ago, long before I relocated, my mother had treated me as her unpaid administrative assistant. She would routinely hand me massive, disorganized boxes of financial records, tax receipts, and legal correspondence, demanding that I scan and digitize them because she found the technology entirely too frustrating to learn. I had spent countless late nights feeding crinkled papers into a cheap scanner, organizing her chaotic life into neatly labeled digital folders while she watched television in the next room. As I clicked through those old archives, hunting for any previous mentions of the family shell corporation, my cursor hovered over a digital folder labeled with my late grandmother's name. A strange, undeniable instinct urged me to open it. Inside, buried beneath scanned utility bills and old medical receipts, I found a series of complex property deeds and estate transfer logs. I opened a faded digital copy of my grandmother's final will and testament. I read through the dense legal jargon until I reached the section detailing a large tract of undeveloped commercial land she owned just outside the city limits. The document was explicitly clear. The land was to be held in a secure trust and then divided equally, 50% to me and 50% to my brother. Upon the exact date I reached my 30th birthday. I am currently 33 years old. I had never received a single document, phone call, or bank transfer regarding the sale of that land. I printed the entire digital folder, placed the papers into a heavy leather briefcase, and scheduled an emergency consultation with a senior civil litigation attorney in downtown Milwaukee. Her office was quiet, lined with thick law books, and she possessed a sharp, analytical demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I sat across from her polished glass desk and watched in absolute silence as she methodically traced the financial paper trail spanning nearly a decade. It took her less than an hour to unravel the entire scheme. She looked up from the documents, her expression tight with professional disgust. She explained that my parents, acting as the primary executors of the estate, had quietly liquidated the entire parcel of land exactly 5 years ago. They had exploited a highly obscure loophole in the trust management language, effectively bypassing my required legal consent. The timeline she laid out was devastatingly precise. The exact month they sold my inheritance was the exact same month my brother's first mobile food truck venture completely collapsed under a mountain of health code violations and unpaid municipal fines. They had not used their own retirement savings to bail him out of that disaster. As they had always tearfully claimed to our extended relatives, they had used my money. They had secretly drained my future financial stability to plug the massive, self-inflicted holes in his reckless life. But the betrayal did not end there. The attorney pointed to a second chain of wire transfers. The remaining capital from the sale of my grandmother's land had not been saved or reinvested for my benefit. It had been funneled directly into the newly formed Family Shell Corporation. My stolen inheritance was the foundational seed money they used to purchase the Hollow Creek property for his new flagship restaurant. I walked out of the law office and stood on the busy Milwaukee sidewalk, the cold wind whipping against my face. The sheer scale of their deception forced me to completely reevaluate every single memory I held of my family. For years, I had quietly absorbed their endless praise about how independent I was, how I never needed their help, and how incredibly understanding I always proved to be. I used to wear those descriptions like a badge of honor. Now, standing on the concrete pavement, those words tasted like pure poison. Their praise was never about admiring my strength. It was a calculated, insidious manipulation. They constantly praised my self-sufficiency because it guaranteed I would never look closely at the family finances. They reinforced my independence because it meant I would never ask for the money they had already stolen from me. They had not merely favored their golden son with emotional support. They had actively, secretly cannibalized my future to ensure his survival. Every time my mother smiled and told me I was the stable child, she was actively covering up a massive financial crime committed against me. They did not just rely on my quiet endurance, they maliciously exploited it. I returned to my desk at the Research Institute the following morning. The lingering sting of the family betrayal had completely hardened into a dense, unbreakable armor of pure resolve. I opened my encrypted workstation and pulled up the latest intelligence reports generated by our joint task force. While I was digesting the theft of my inheritance, the investigative team had completely dismantled the waste disposal contracts I had flagged earlier in the week. The evidence was absolute and entirely undeniable. The hazardous waste transport company hired by the new barbecue facility was not just a minor regulatory violator, it was a complete phantom. There were 0 registered trucks, 0 licensed chemical handlers, and no physical headquarters. The corporate address listed on their official invoices belonged to a vacant, crumbling strip mall located 2 counties over. The toxic organic runoff, the heavy rendering grease, and the chemical cleaning agents were never leaving the Hollow Creek property. The data suggested with terrifying certainty that they were simply dumping the waste directly into the unlined holding pits, allowing it to slowly seep into the porous limestone aquifer directly above the low-income residential wells. As I cross-referenced the fraudulent vendor logs with the municipal licensing approvals, a new, highly disturbing pattern emerged from the digital noise. My predictive algorithm highlighted a series of internal electronic mails exchanged between the family shell corporation and the county government offices. I traced the communication pathways and uncovered a specific name that appeared at every single critical juncture. It was a senior county planning commissioner. This official had personally intervened on over a dozen separate occasions to quietly bypass standard environmental reviews for the new facility. He had manually overridden the automated red flags regarding the extreme proximity to the residential water table. He had forcefully expedited the construction permits and aggressively pushed the final operational licenses through the system, completely ignoring the glaring lack of verified waste management protocols. He was not making careless administrative errors. He was actively, deliberately shielding the operation from any legitimate legal scrutiny. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and stared at the glowing monitors illuminating my dark office. The entire landscape of the conflict had shifted violently beneath my feet. This was no longer a simple narrative about a neglected daughter nursing a broken heart over a missed graduation ceremony. This was no longer just a bitter civil dispute about stolen inheritance money and a deeply toxic family dynamic. I was staring at a highly coordinated network of systemic corruption. It involved severe environmental negligence, corporate fraud, and active political collusion at the county level. My family had arrogantly built their fraudulent empire on top of a poisoned water supply, fully believing that their local political connections and my stolen money would render them completely untouchable. They thought they could silence me by stealing my professional credibility, just as they had silenced me for 33 years by ignoring my existence. They were entirely wrong. I gathered the legal notes regarding my stolen inheritance, the definitive proof of the phantom waste disposal company, and the digital trail exposing the corrupt county commissioner. I locked them all inside my secure server. I felt no sorrow, no hesitation, and absolutely no lingering desire for their affection. I was standing at the edge of a massive, intricate maze of their own making, and for the very first time in my life, I held every single key required to burn it entirely to the ground. I did not waste my energy screaming into the void. The time for emotional arguments and tearful family confrontations had permanently expired. I methodically began to build a fortress of undeniable facts. I retained 2 entirely separate legal counsels to dismantle the different fronts of their deception. The first was a razor-sharp attorney specializing in federal whistleblower protection and corporate retaliation. The second was the civil litigation expert I had already consulted, the woman who officially took on the massive case of my stolen inheritance. I paid their substantial retainer fees using the exact funds I had carefully saved from my research grants over the last 5 years. I signed the heavy stacks of legal agreements on a Tuesday morning, authorizing them to move forward with lethal, unyielding precision. With my personal legal shields firmly in place, I walked straight into the executive legal department of the Caldwell Center. The general counsel was a formidable woman who did not tolerate corporate liability. I handed her a thick binder containing the date-stamped digital screenshots of the fraudulent promotional website, a verified copy of my formal cease and desist letter, and the original electronic mail I had sent to my father explicitly warning him of the catastrophic site failures. I made it absolutely clear to my employers that I was being non-consensually paraded as a shadow advisor for an illegal, high-risk operation. The corporate lawyers immediately took possession of the binder. They initiated an internal firewall protocol that permanently immunized me from any potential fallout. I was officially on the record as a hostile witness against the shell corporation operated by my own blood. Next came the technical execution of my professional duty. I compiled the devastating data regarding the phantom waste disposal company, the manually altered temperature logs, and the highly illegal proximity of the unlined holding pits to the residential water table. I bundled this raw, undeniable data and routed it directly to the North Vale Environmental Review Board. They were a regional oversight authority, operating with a notoriously aggressive mandate. They did not care about local county politics, friendly political donations, or backroom handshakes. They cared exclusively about chemical parts per million, soil saturation levels, and strict federal compliance mandates. I did not send them a passionate plea for justice. I sent them rigorous mathematical proof of an impending public health disaster. They possess the unilateral power to trigger immediate, unannounced physical site inspections, and I handed them a flawless map leading directly to the target. While I operated in total secrecy, relying entirely on the cold mechanics of the legal system, my brother chose the loudest, most public arena possible. When the cease and desist letter landed on his desk, forcing him to legally scrub my name and academic credentials from his marketing materials, he completely lost his composure. He did not call me to apologize for the identity theft. Instead, he took to his sprawling social media platforms. He began posting long, emotionally manipulative updates on a daily basis. He posted heavily filtered photographs of himself standing in front of the unfinished wooden frame of the new restaurant, staring solemnly into the middle distance. He painted a vague but easily recognizable picture of a bitter, highly educated family member who was insanely jealous of his impending commercial success. He framed himself as the ultimate underdog. He wrote impassioned, misspelled essays about the working-class American dream being maliciously crushed by elitist relatives who turned their backs on their own flesh and blood. I offered absolutely no public rebuttal. I did not leave a single comment on his pages. I did not post a defensive statement about my academic record, nor did I mention the stolen inheritance money that funded his precious American dream. My silence was absolute, and it drove him completely out of his mind. He was fundamentally programmed to thrive on chaotic conflict and immediate attention. By refusing to engage in his public theater, I starved him of the very oxygen he needed to validate his manufactured victimhood. His digital posts grew increasingly frantic and unhinged, spiraling from mild disappointment to aggressive, rambling accusations. I simply sat in my quiet duplex, drinking hot tea, and watched him systematically self-destruct in real time. Instead of fighting ghosts on the internet, I channeled my resources into the only people who actually mattered in this entire disaster. Through the secure channels of my whistleblower attorney, I established a blind connection with a community organizer in the low-income neighborhood bordering the Hollow Creek property. I completely anonymized my financial involvement. I absolutely refused to be seen as a savior seeking moral redemption. I simply provided the necessary financial backing and the exact legal templates the residents needed to apply for an independent, state-funded water testing grant. I ensured the neighborhood had the necessary weapons to defend themselves, allowing them to hire an independent hydrologist to take baseline soil and water samples before the contaminated grease ever reached their drinking wells. The absolute peak of my family reacting to their loss of control arrived on a rainy Thursday evening, exactly 3 weeks after I initiated the legal barrage. I heard a hesitant, soft knock on the front door of my duplex. When I opened the heavy wooden door, I found my mother standing on the wet concrete porch. She was holding a large tin containing a homemade pecan pie. She looked incredibly small. Her shoulders slumped under a damp trench coat, and her face was lined with a deep, gray exhaustion I had never witnessed before. She had driven hundreds of miles through a storm just to stand on my doorstep in Milwaukee. I stepped aside and let her inside the house, but I did not offer to make a warm pot of coffee. I did not take her wet coat or offer her a towel. We stood awkwardly in the center of my sparse living room. She set the tin pie on the kitchen counter and immediately launched into her rehearsed speech. Her voice trembled as she begged me to call off the lawyers. She pleaded with me not to let things go any further, claiming that the immense stress was physically destroying my father and pushing Mason to the absolute brink of a total nervous breakdown. She tried to invoke the sacred, unbreakable bond of family, desperately weaponizing nostalgia and maternal guilt in a frantic attempt to disarm the massive legal trap slowly closing around them. I stood perfectly still, my expression entirely blank, and let her talk until she completely ran out of breath. When she finally realized that her usual emotional tactics were bouncing harmlessly off an impenetrable wall of my indifference, her voice cracked. In a moment of sheer, unfiltered desperation, she abandoned the script and blurted out the absolute ugliest truth of our entire family dynamic. She looked at me with tear-filled eyes, her hands shaking, and said that Mason was always the one who could break easier, but I could always handle it. The silence that followed her statement was incredibly heavy, expanding to fill every single corner of the room. She had finally admitted the core operational philosophy of my entire childhood. I was punished simply because I was resilient. They had systematically crushed me to pad the walls for him, justifying their cruelty by telling themselves I was strong enough to survive it. I did not scream at her. I did not cry. And I certainly did not throw the tin of pie against the wall. I looked directly into her tired eyes and delivered a single, quiet sentence with the absolute force of a steel blade. Being able to handle it does not mean I deserve to be treated that way. I watched the remaining color completely drain from her face. For the very first time in my entire 33 years of life, my mother had absolutely no rebuttal. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The convenient, comfortable delusion she had used to justify decades of blatant neglect and financial theft shattered instantly on the hardwood floor between us. She slowly turned around, pulled her damp coat tighter around her shoulders, walked out the front door, and drove away into the cold rain, leaving the pie sitting untouched on the counter. The execution arrived not with sirens or dramatic police raids, but with a fleet of white government vehicles parking neatly on the fresh gravel of the property. It was exactly 48 hours before the highly publicized grand opening of the restaurant. A team of field inspectors from the Regional Environmental Board stepped out of their cars wearing hard hats and carrying thick binders. They bypassed the polished tasting rooms and the decorative rustic fire pits completely. They marched straight to the back of the property, operating with the cold efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were looking for because they had been given a flawless map. They found exactly what my data models predicted they would find. The massive wastewater holding ponds were entirely devoid of the legally mandated industrial lining. The soil beneath the containment area was already dark and saturated with thick organic runoff, poisoning the ground with every passing hour. When the lead inspector demanded the physical temperature logs for the commercial meat rendering vats, my father handed over a ledger that was painfully amateurish. The numbers were written in the exact same handwriting, using the exact same blue ink for 3 consecutive months, showing absolutely zero natural fluctuation. It was a blatant, lazy forgery that insulted the intelligence of anyone reading it. Then came the rigorous review of the waste transport manifests. The inspectors ran the vendor credentials through their live federal database right there in the gravel parking lot under the afternoon sun. The phantom contractor dissolved instantly into thin air. There were no signatures from authorized chemical handlers, no registered transport vehicles, and no valid commercial licenses. There were only fake scribbles from a company that simply did not exist outside of a fraudulent invoice ledger. Simultaneously, the independent hydrologist hired by the neighborhood coalition returned the initial groundwater samples. The water drawn from 2 separate residential wells immediately adjacent to the southern property line yielded highly abnormal results. The contamination levels had not yet reached the threshold of a catastrophic medical emergency, but the baseline spikes in nitrates and dangerous bacterial compounds were severe enough to mandate a massive, invasive federal investigation. The invisible poison was already creeping toward the surface, validating every single warning I had issued. The financial dominoes began to fall before the inspectors even drove their vehicles off the lot. The regulatory freeze implemented by the board was an automated public record. Within 4 hours of the citation being filed, the primary venture capital firm backing my brother suspended their entire cash injection. They froze all incoming capital indefinitely pending a full legal and environmental review. That very same afternoon, a prominent retail partner who was scheduled to sign a massive regional franchising agreement at the grand opening abruptly canceled their flight. They completely severed all corporate ties, citing a strict zero-tolerance policy for environmental negligence and regulatory fraud. The sudden, violently rapid evaporation of their funding triggered an immediate and spectacular implosion within my family. The unified front they had maintained for decades instantly collapsed into vicious, ugly infighting. The illusion of their unconditional love and unwavering support was finally stripped away by the sheer terror of absolute financial ruin. My brother completely lost his temper inside the empty, heavily decorated dining room of his failed flagship restaurant. He screamed at my father, his voice echoing off the expensive wood paneling, blaming him for being greedy and pushing the expansion timeline too aggressively without securing the proper legal permits. My father, stripped of his usual arrogant composure and facing total bankruptcy, fired back with equal venom. He shouted that my brother was nothing but an incompetent, spoiled child who only knew how to burn through cash and play a fake image game on the internet while completely ignoring the actual, difficult mechanics of running a legitimate business. The golden boy was finally being held accountable by the very man who had enabled his reckless behavior for his entire life. My mother did not try to soothe their bruised egos. She did not bake anything or offer gentle words of encouragement to de-escalate the situation. Her lifelong role as the domestic peacemaker vanished completely. She sat at a raw wooden table in the unfinished restaurant, trembling in pure, unadulterated panic. She knew a devastating truth that my brother had conveniently ignored in his pursuit of fame. The yellow house in North Carolina, the childhood home where I grew up, had been leveraged to the absolute hilt. My parents had quietly taken out a massive second mortgage to secure the initial commercial loans for this doomed project. With the investors fleeing, the property frozen by the government, and the incoming legal fines promising to be astronomical, the bank would inevitably come to collect. The realization that they were going to lose their home entirely paralyzed her. Then, the local media caught the scent of the blood in the water. What began as a standard municipal report on a delayed restaurant opening quickly mutated into a massive regional scandal. A sharp investigative journalist from a prominent local newspaper started digging deeply into the corporate background of the family shell company. She utilized an internet archiving tool to pull up the deleted versions of the promotional website. She found the exact sentence my brother had fabricated. The article hit the digital front pages the very next morning. The headline did not focus solely on the unlined waste pits or the forged temperature logs. It focused heavily on the blatant theft of academic credibility. The journalist exposed exactly how the owners had maliciously attached the name and professional title of a leading environmental systems researcher to falsely validate a highly dangerous and illegal operation. She detailed the cease and desist order and the complete lack of actual scientific oversight. The narrative instantly shifted from a simple zoning violation to a deliberate, calculated campaign of corporate fraud, media deception, and profound ethical bankruptcy. It was a story about wealthy developers lying to the public and risking the health of an entire vulnerable community just to secure investor capital. The public backlash was immediate, loud, and utterly brutal. My telephone began to ring constantly. Reporters, industry bloggers, and television news producers were desperate for a quote. They wanted me to publicly condemn my family, to express my shock and horror, or to confirm the full extent of the identity theft on camera. I did not answer a single call. I did not issue a carefully crafted press release. I maintained an absolute, unbreakable silence. I went to my office at the Research Institute, drank my morning coffee, and continued my work analyzing data. I let the authenticated legal documents, the independent water testing results, and the unyielding environmental data speak entirely for themselves. I watched the entire structure of my family violently tear itself apart from a safe, quiet distance. For 33 years, whenever they broke something, I was always there to quietly sweep up the glass. I was the one who absorbed their failures, regulated their chaotic emotions, and stabilized their lives at the expense of my own peace. But this time, they had shattered something far too massive, and they were completely alone in the wreckage. There was no one left to shield them from the heavy, crushing consequences of their own arrogance. The reality they had tried so hard to avoid had finally arrived, and I was not going to lift a single finger to save them. The atmosphere in the conference room of my whistleblower attorney was suffocatingly tense. We were sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after I first discovered the fraudulent website. My lawyer turned her laptop monitor toward me, her face completely devoid of expression. During the aggressive discovery phase, Her legal team had subpoenaed the digital communication records between the family shell corporation and their prospective venture capital firm. They had unearthed a master pitch deck, a highly polished 50-page presentation designed to secure a massive series of funding. I read through the glossy digital slides, my blood turning to absolute ice. They were not just planning to open a single restaurant. The pitch deck outlined an aggressive, multi-state expansion plan moving straight into commercial retail. They were pitching a nationwide rollout of bottled barbecue sauces and vacuum-sealed packaged meats. And right there, on the 14th slide, was a full page dedicated to their corporate leadership team. My face, lifted directly from my university faculty directory, was plastered next to a fabricated job title. They had listed me as their chief scientific advisor. The text below my photograph promised investors that every single product line and supply chain logistical route was personally vetted by a leading environmental systems researcher. But the true horror was buried in the legal appendix of the presentation. My attorney pulled up a drafted, unsigned employment contract. It was a binding legal document specifically designed to officially lock me into that exact role the moment the funding round closed. The signature line at the bottom was blank, waiting for either a highly sophisticated forgery or a manipulated electronic authorization. The air in the room grew incredibly heavy. This revelation fundamentally shifted the entire landscape of their betrayal. This was no longer a case of a careless, arrogant family trying to borrow my academic prestige for a local marketing boost. This was a highly calculated, malicious strategy to integrate me into the structural foundation of a massive corporate fraud. If those venture capitalists had signed the term sheets, and if the illegal waste dumping at the Hollow Creek property had subsequently triggered a federal environmental catastrophe, I would not have been just an embarrassed bystander. As their documented chief scientific advisor, I would have been legally tethered to the disaster. I would have faced immediate career termination, severe civil liabilities, and very likely federal criminal charges. They were completely willing to serve me up as the ultimate legal collateral just to secure their initial millions. I left the office feeling a terrifying, crystalline clarity. I drove back to my duplex, only to find another devastating piece of evidence waiting in my secure inbox. My civil litigation attorney, the one handling the stolen inheritance, had just forwarded a newly unsealed cache of documents retrieved from the estate financial records. Among the bank transfer receipts was an electronic mail thread between my mother and my father, dated precisely 5 years ago. I opened the file and read the words my mother had typed into existence. She was discussing the liquidation of my grandmother's commercial land. In plain, undeniable English, she explicitly instructed my father to route the capital directly into my brother's failing business accounts. The following sentence was the one that finally killed whatever microscopic shred of hope I had left for my family. My mother wrote that they absolutely needed to keep the transaction entirely hidden from me to prevent me from causing unnecessary drama and making a scene. For my entire adult life, I had generously attributed their horrific treatment of me to a form of passive, unconscious bias. I had convinced myself that they were simply blind to my needs, because they were so blinded by my brother's chaotic light. I thought their neglect was accidental. But staring at that electronic mail, I possessed undeniable, black and white proof that their actions were fiercely intentional. My mother knew exactly what she was doing. She knew the land was legally mine. She knew stealing it was a profound violation, and she consciously chose to orchestrate a cover-up. The stable, understanding daughter routine they always praised me for was actually just a cage they built to keep me quiet while they robbed me blind. Later that same evening, the silence of my living room was broken by the sharp chime of an incoming message. It was an electronic mail directly from my mother. It was the longest communication she had ever sent me in my entire 33 years of existence. It was a sprawling, frantic wall of text, dripping with desperation and carefully constructed victimhood. She wrote extensively about the crushing pressure they were under, the terrifying prospect of losing their home to the bank, and the severe emotional toll the public scandal was taking on my father. She dedicated 3 entire paragraphs to rationalizing the theft of my inheritance. She claimed that she always viewed family resources as a shared pool, and that she genuinely thought they just needed to wait for my brother's business to finally stabilize before they could find a way to make everything up to me. She framed the massive financial theft as a temporary, unfortunate borrowing situation driven by maternal love. I read the entire message twice. I searched every single line, every paragraph, and every desperate sentence. Not once did she use the word sorry. Not once did she apologize for risking my professional freedom, for stealing my financial future, or for treating me like a disposable asset. She was only terrified of the consequences, entirely unremorseful for the crimes. I did not draft a long, emotional rebuttal. I did not point out the hypocrisy or scream at her through the keyboard. I highlighted her message, saved a duplicate copy directly to my encrypted legal file, and hit the reply button. I typed a single, isolated sentence. No one can make up for what they continually choose to take away. I sent the message and instantly blocked her electronic mail address. The door was now permanently locked. The final, inevitable escalation arrived 2 days later via certified government mail. The Regional Environmental Authority, the North Vale Environmental Review Board, officially concluded their preliminary field investigations. The sheer volume of the violations, combined with the intense public scrutiny generated by the media exposure, meant this case could no longer be handled with quiet administrative fines or closed-door settlements. The board issued a formal summons. They scheduled a mandatory, highly publicized public hearing to take place at the end of the month. This single hearing would unilaterally determine the permanent fate of the operating license for the Hollow Creek facility. Furthermore, it would establish the exact scale of the civil penalties, the environmental remediation costs, and the direct liability of the corporate officers involved. Every single knot in this massive, twisted narrative was now being pulled tightly toward one specific destination. The stolen money, the forged documents, the poisoned water, and the decades of profound psychological manipulation were all converging on a sterile, wood-paneled government hearing room. My parents and my brother could no longer hide behind fake social media posts, tearful excuses in my living room, or their carefully cultivated local reputation. They were going to be forced to sit in hard wooden chairs, under the glaring fluorescent lights, in front of a panel of ruthless federal adjudicators, a gallery full of furious local residents, and a swarm of hungry journalists. They were going to be forced to sit in absolute silence and listen as the full, unvarnished truth of their greed was read directly into the permanent public record, and I was going to be the one holding the microphone. The storm had finally gathered its full strength, and the impending crash was going to be absolutely spectacular. The air inside the North Vale Environmental Review Board hearing room was stale, smelling faintly of lemon floor wax and old paper. I walked through the heavy double doors wearing a tailored charcoal suit. I did not look like a bitter, estranged daughter seeking petty vengeance. I looked exactly like what I was, a senior environmental systems researcher holding an ironclad portfolio of undeniable facts. I took my seat at the witness table beside my legal counsel, adjusting the microphone in front of me. Across the center aisle, my family sat huddled together behind their own defense attorneys. My brother looked pale and sweaty, his usual arrogant posture completely deflated. My father stared straight ahead with a rigid, furious jaw. My mother kept her eyes glued to the polished wooden table, her hands trembling so violently that her silver bracelets clattered together. When the lead adjudicator called my name, I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute clinical precision. I walked the board members through a flawlessly clean timeline. I detailed the exact week my predictive algorithms flagged the anomalies. I provided the specific date and time I issued my private, internal warning to the corporate officers of Green Ember Hospitality. I submitted the certified screen captures, proving the unauthorized and highly illegal use of my academic credentials on their promotional materials. Finally, I submitted the formal internal memorandum from the Caldwell Center, proving that I had voluntarily and immediately recused myself from the final policy recommendation phase the moment I realized my blood relatives were the primary targets of the investigation. I left absolutely no room for anyone to question my professional integrity or my ethical boundaries. The defense attorney representing my brother stood up, aggressively adjusting his tie. Lacking any actual scientific data to refute my claims, he attempted to completely assassinate my character. He painted a highly melodramatic picture for the board. He claimed I was nothing more than a deeply unstable, jealous sibling who had orchestrated this entire regulatory nightmare simply because my family had missed my doctoral commencement ceremony. He tried to reduce a catastrophic environmental crime into a pathetic domestic squabble, hoping the board would dismiss my technical findings as the fabrications of a woman holding a childish grudge. My whistleblower attorney did not even bother to stand up. She simply slid a single piece of paper across the projector glass. It was the digital copy of the initial electronic mail I had sent to my father and my brother. The timestamp clearly showed that I had explicitly warned them to halt the opening, hire independent auditors, and fix the holding pits weeks before the Environmental Board ever initiated their unannounced inspection. My attorney looked directly at the defense table and stated that her client had actively tried to save them from the legal system, but they had arrogantly chosen to ignore the warning and forge her signature instead. The defense attorney slowly sat down, completely out of ammunition. The most devastating shock of the afternoon, however, did not come from the environmental data. Because the hearings regarding the corporate fines were deeply intertwined with the civil liabilities of the company, the financial architecture of their shell corporation was pulled into the harsh light of the public record. My civil litigation attorney introduced the estate transfer logs. She laid out the exact financial pathway showing how the money from my stolen inheritance had been quietly siphoned off for years to prop up my brother and his endless string of failed businesses, before finally being injected into the Hollow Creek project. The lead adjudicator, a stern man with white hair, looked directly at my mother. He demanded to know why the corporate officers had resorted to stealing trust funds to secure their commercial loans instead of utilizing traditional banking channels. My mother was forced to stand up in front of a room packed with furious local residents, hungry journalists, and federal regulators. She gripped the edge of the table, tears streaming down her face. Cornered by the sheer weight of the perjury laws, she finally confessed the ugly, naked truth of our family dynamic to the entire world. She admitted, her voice cracking through the sound system, that they had never prioritized Mason because he was a better businessman or because he actually deserved the capital. She confessed that they gave him everything, including my future, simply because he made the entire household absolutely miserable if he did not get exactly what he wanted. She admitted that it was always easier to steal from the quiet daughter who never complained than to deal with the exhausting, endless tantrums of the golden son. The absolute silence in the hearing room following her confession was deafening. The illusion was entirely shattered. The consequences were swift and absolutely merciless. The Environmental Board issued a unanimous ruling. The operating licenses for Fireline Pit House and all associated meat rendering facilities were permanently and entirely revoked. The corporate entity, Green Ember Hospitality, was hit with crippling, massive civil fines for extreme environmental negligence and the deliberate falsification of government records. The county planning commissioner who had helped them bypass the initial zoning laws was formally referred to the state attorney general for a separate criminal investigation regarding political corruption. My brother lost every single piece of his grand empire. The remaining franchise agreements evaporated, and his venture capital backing was permanently terminated. In the civil branch of the fallout, the rulings were equally decisive. I was awarded full financial restitution for the stolen inheritance, complete with years of compounded interest. Furthermore, I secured a massive settlement for the fraudulent use of my professional reputation and academic title in their investor pitch deck. The financial penalties effectively wiped out whatever remaining assets my parents held, but the twist that truly left everyone breathless did not revolve around the money I took from them. It was exactly what I chose to do with it. I did not use the massive settlement to buy a luxury vehicle or a massive house to flaunt my victory. I took a significant portion of the recovered funds and established a permanent, fully endowed community water testing foundation. I named the trust after my late grandmother, the woman whose land they had stolen. The foundation was designed to provide free, independent environmental screening and legal support for low-income, rural neighborhoods that were historically ignored by massive corporate developers. I took another large portion of the capital and created a dedicated research scholarship at my former university. It was specifically earmarked for first-generation female doctoral candidates in the hard sciences. I wrote the charter myself, dedicating the funds to the brilliant, quiet women who had spent their entire lives being told that their academic achievements could always wait until after the family dinner was served. The climax of my vengeance was not found in their destruction. They had destroyed themselves with their own arrogant hands. My victory was found in my absolute refusal to shrink myself to fit their narrative anymore. The story ended in a highly sterile, brightly lit hallway outside the municipal hearing chambers. The crowds had dispersed, and the journalists were busy filing their reports. I was walking toward the exit when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw my mother standing a few feet away. She looked completely hollowed out, carrying the heavy weight of a woman who had just lost her home, her reputation, and her favorite son, and all in the same afternoon. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, and asked in a barely audible whisper if there was any chance left in the world to fix this. She asked if we could ever be a family again. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had watched me succeed in total isolation, and then stolen my security to feed my brother. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no sorrow. I just felt an immense, peaceful emptiness. I told her that forgiveness might come somewhere down the road, or it might never come at all. But I made it absolutely clear that from this day forward, I would never, ever return to being the silent, accommodating daughter. I would never again make their lives easier by making my own life smaller. I turned my back and walked out through the heavy glass doors into the bright afternoon sun. For the very first time in my life, I was standing at my true, absolute size. And as I walked away, leaving her standing alone in the quiet hallway, I knew that my sheer, unyielding presence was the only thing that had truly shocked them. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let us share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your incredible support by pressing the hype button so that this story can be heard by many more people around the world.